In 1886, a book appeared destined to cause discomfort from its first reading. Beyond Good and Evil was published by a sick, isolated thinker displaced from his time. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote from a profound rupture with academia, religion, and inherited morality. Here begins a constant pressure on values, on truth, and on the very way of thinking. Nothing is presented as a stable foundation. Everything remains exposed to a gaze that digs, measures, and hierarchizes. When good and evil stop supporting the world as before, what remains? The desire to search under the magnifying glass, instincts that use logic. For a long time, philosophers have spoken of truth as if it were something sacred, like an impulse elevated to a value in itself. The more closely that desire is observed, the more uncomfortable the questions surrounding it become. That impulse pushes one to know, to risk, to force, to insist even when the ground becomes unstable. At a certain point, attention stops focusing on what is being sought and begins to turn towards something else, the desire to search itself. Then a deeper question arises, one that is rarely asked. What value does that will really have which insists on wanting the truth? Why that desire occupies that place, why uncertainty, ignorance, or the renunciation of such a firm need are relegated in the face of the idea that truth is worth more than everything else. That problem has followed a particular path. It was avoided, surrounded, venerated. When it is finally placed in front, the risk appears, a greater risk than that of being wrong, that of discovering that what was considered untouchable admits examination. For centuries, philosophers started from a fixed idea. They thought that valuable things must come from a pure place, that the true arose separate from error, that the selfless remained alien to selfishness, that the elevated had roots different from the low. That way of thinking became the basis of classical metaphysics, a deep faith in oppositions, good and evil, truth and appearance, spirit and body. That division was accepted as a starting point, and from there, entire systems were built. Error is installed in that first step, in that initial confidence. Oppositions appear as imagined constructions, and what is considered noble reveals itself intertwined from its origin with that which is despised. Life shows another possible functioning. That which sustains living beings adopts ambiguous forms. Illusion, deception, simplification, and even error exert a decisive weight against pure ideas. What was called good extracts part of its strength from its kinship with what was called bad. That possibility is uncomfortable and has been avoided. Thinking like this requires another type of philosopher, someone who tolerates danger, who advances when the ground becomes slippery and crosses inherited certainties. Thinking then appears as an embodied activity. It is born in the body, in the impulses, in the instincts. Conscious thought occupies a small space. Behind every reasoning, even the most rigorous older forces operate. Silent evaluations, physiological needs, tendencies oriented toward preserving a certain way of life. Logic responds to those demands. It prefers the stable, the defined, the manageable. From that angle, falsehood adopts another function. A judgment can be false and yet still be indispensable. Many basic beliefs that sustain the human experience do not withstand rigorous examination and nevertheless allow one to live. Abandoning them would imply abandoning life itself. Accepting this involves crossing an uncomfortable border and moving outside habitual values. Philosophers rarely recognize this background frankly. They proclaim purity, objectivity, and selflessness. They present themselves as impartial discoverers. Behind their arguments operate prior decisions, desires that seek justification, and instincts that found an elegant language to sustain themselves. Every philosophical system ends up functioning as an involuntary confession. For this reason, it is convenient to observe philosophers with caution, not for their errors, but for their way of presenting themselves. They speak of truth while guarding their motivations. They defend conclusions with skill, and they elevate personal convictions to the category of principle. All philosophy expresses an interior hierarchy, an order of impulses, a morality of its own. Thought always appears accompanied by a will that acts. Even when one speaks of pure knowledge, that will orients, selects, and uses knowledge as an instrument. Mockery and satire pointed this out long ago. Some thinkers sensed it more clearly than others, because thought also has style, rhythm, and gesture. In that gesture filters through what moves the one who thinks. When one speaks of living according to nature, another illusion arises. Nature shows itself alien to human values. Living implies choosing, preferring, excluding. Imposing a morality on it is to project oneself onto the world and then call it law. Each philosophy models the world in its image. Creating concepts implies exercising power, interpreting involves ordering, and every interpretation carries a form of dominance. Science participates in this same movement. It presents itself as explanation and operates as interpretation. It trusts the senses because they are convincing, because they show, because they touch. That trust responds to a taste, to a preference, to a way of looking. Even the most immediate certainties dissolve under close observation. Thought arrives wrapped in assumptions, habits of language, and grammatical structures that carry interpretations. Saying "I think" already introduces a construction. The will appears as a network of feelings, thoughts, impulses, and internal orders. Commanding and obeying occur at the same time, and from there arises the feeling of freedom, a feeling of power that accompanies the successful act. Morality was formed from that feeling, from the idea of absolute responsibility, and from the belief in an individual who creates himself. That idea generates pride in some and relief in others, and in both cases covers the real complexity of the process. Psychology, as long as it remains tied to moral prejudices, advances with difficulty. Exploring impulses causes vertigo and opens a new territory where thinking stops being comfortable and begins to become dangerous, and in that danger, thought advances. Faith that wears down reason, cross, renunciation, and sacrifice. The territory of the human soul remains immense. Its edges remain open. The heights it has reached, the depths to which it has descended, and the distances it has traveled inward remain largely unexplored. For one who possesses the instinct of a hunter and directs their gaze inward, that terrain is irresistible. Even so, the feeling that repeats is always the same: too much extension and too few explorers. The desire to have many eyes, many hands, and attentive bloodhounds to help follow the trail of the history of the human soul stumbles time and again over the same difficulty. Just where the terrain becomes most dangerous, those who present themselves as prepared lose their sight and smell. Where the hunt becomes large, the risk also grows, and it is then when the assistants fail. To understand what has happened with science and with consciousness within the religious man requires a depth comparable to that of those who took that experience to the extreme. It is necessary to have been wounded in that way, to have passed through that fire, and to retain enough clarity to order from above that chaos of intense experiences. Those profiles appear infrequently. Meanwhile, the one who wants to know advances in solitude. The faith demanded by early Christianity adopted a complex and demanding form. It arose in a world full of skepticism, of clashing philosophies, and of learned tolerance. From there it reclaimed something more radical: the complete surrender of reason. Thought entered a process of progressive wear, sustained by sacrifice, humiliation, and renunciation, and applied to a complex, refined, and already highly developed consciousness. That faith produced a brutal reversal. The image of a God on the cross functioned as an unprecedented provocation, a reversal that reached all existing values and generated deep consequences. In that scenario appeared freedom in the face of faith, the aristocratic lightness that mocked the absolute. The slave seeks the unconditional, loves and hates without nuances, and his resentment found a form of expression there. Where religious neurosis arises, it usually appears accompanied by certain practices: isolation, deprivation, renunciation. Establishing clear relationships becomes an arduous task, because the phenomenon presents extreme complexity and a great amount of superstitions and errors have accumulated around it. That accumulation makes distance advisable. The figure of the saint exerted fascination for centuries because of the appearance of a miracle, because of that abrupt transformation that seemed to suddenly turn an ordinary man into something completely different. Traditional psychology showed its limits by accepting without examination the moral oppositions that sustained that interpretation. The forms of religiosity are distributed unevenly among peoples. In Latin cultures, Catholicism was integrated in an organic way. In the North, unbelief usually functions as a return to an older and less religious background. From there are born differences in tone, sensitivity, and language. Some religious expressions result strange or irritating, depending on the place from which they are heard. In the ancient Greeks, religiosity was shot through with gratitude, an attitude characteristic of an upper class toward life. When that balance is broken and the plebeians gain weight, fear appears and the ground is prepared for other forms of faith. Passion for God adopts multiple forms. Some are coarse, others refined. Sometimes it manifests as exaltation, others as repressed desire, others as a last attempt at meaning. The Church recognized those forms and, on more than one occasion, elevated them. Powerful men looked at the saint with a mixture of respect and distrust, moved by the force that was hidden behind his renunciation. They recognized there a will capable of dominating itself, and that awakened questions, because where such an extreme renunciation appears, there usually exists a profound reason. The Old Testament retains a greatness that overwhelms. In it, everything is presented as excessive. Facing that, Europe acquires a smaller profile. The preference for the New Testament reveals a different sensitivity, softer, more adapted. The union of both texts in a single book constituted a reckless gesture. Modern atheism arises from a specific distrust. The figure of God as Father, Judge, and Guarantor loses effectiveness, while the religious impulse remains active and seeks other forms. Modern philosophy, by questioning the subject, reaches one of the pillars of Christianity. Without declaring itself anti-religious, it weakens its base. The idea of the soul, held for centuries, begins to crack. The history of religious cruelty runs through several stages. First appears the sacrifice of others, then the sacrifice of one's own impulses, finally the sacrifice of God himself, the worship of nothingness. That extreme gesture belongs to the present. He who has traversed pessimism to the bottom can discover, without seeking it, its opposite. A total affirmation of life, a desire for repetition, and an acceptance without reservations. As the gaze sharpens, the world expands. New enigmas arise. Perhaps one day the most solemn ideas will lose their weight and return to the state of toys. Religious life requires free time and idleness with a good conscience. Modern life, noisy and accelerated, reduces that space. From there arises a growing indifference toward the religious, especially among knowledge workers. He who has looked deep understands the function of superficiality. It acts as a strategy of conservation. Religiosity can then be understood as an extreme artistic form, a refined falsification that embellishes existence. Love for man, when born from love for God, reaches a singular height. He who went through that experience left a mark difficult to equal. The philosopher, understood as a free spirit, employs religion as an instrument. According to the human type, religion fulfills different functions: discipline, preparation, comfort. It can educate, elevate, and sustain. It also preserves that which tends to disappear. When religion governs by itself, its danger becomes visible. By systematically protecting the weakest, it slows down the elevation of the human type, reverses values, weakens the strong, and transforms greatness into guilt. From that process emerged the modern European, docile, moderate, and sick. Brief blows without a system, pride, memory, and decisions. Here thought advances in brief blows, as if the author let fall observations that do not ask for permission. The form is open with a sharp gaze. Each sentence appears as a condensed experience. It starts from a clear figure. He who truly teaches is involved only in the relationship with those who listen to him, even with himself. Knowledge, seen this way, acquires an exposed character. Knowing for the sake of knowing reveals itself as a moral trap, an elegant way of returning to the same point that one sought to leave behind. Knowledge attracts because it requires passing through discomforts, shames, and areas where pride remains exposed. The relationship with the divine enters that ambiguous terrain. It is with one's own God that the greatest dishonesty usually occurs. Perfection is demanded of that God. Sometimes lowering oneself, letting oneself be wounded or deceived, appears as the modest gesture of a divinity that walks among humans. To love, when it concentrates on only one, leaves victims around. Loving a God participates in that same violence. Memory and pride clash constantly. Memory affirms and pride offers resistance. In the end, memory prevails. Life itself becomes visible when it is accepted that in it acts a hand that kills softly. There are gestures that seem compassionate and yet destroy. He who has character repeats a single experience under different forms. The gaze of the one who knows matures slowly. While the stars are felt as something superior, the vision remains at a preliminary level. Elevation occurs through the duration of certain states. Reaching an ideal usually coincides with the gesture of leaving it behind. Pride adopts disguises. More than one hides his tail and names it dignity. Genius, when it lacks gratitude and inner cleanliness, becomes unbearable. Sexuality then appears as a force that ascends to the highest point of the spirit, integrated into the whole of the inner life. In times of calm, the combative man directs his aggression toward himself. Principles fulfill multiple functions: to dominate, to justify oneself, to honor oneself, to hide oneself. Two people who share principles pursue different ends. Even he who despises himself retains a form of esteem, that of the despiser. There are souls that know they are loved and remain closed to love. In them, the lowest ascends to the surface. When something is completely explained, it loses interest. For that reason, the excess of self-knowledge leads to sterility. Truth saturated loses its capacity to satiate. Compassion extended to everyone is transformed into hardness toward the closest one. In crises, essential elements are lost from sight, which then reappear among the remains. The learning of hatred advances in some cases at the same rhythm as the loss of enchantment. Affections move at different tempos according to the body that sustains them, and from there many misunderstandings are born. Vanity, intelligence, kindness, and cruelty are intertwined. There are things so cold they burn, so gelid they are confused with fire. Kindness usually hides a deeper contempt than hatred. Maturing implies recovering the seriousness with which one played in childhood. Being ashamed of immorality constitutes a first step. Then appears modesty before one's own morality. Life is abandoned better with gratitude than with attachment. The great man usually seems like an actor who interprets his own ideal. Conscience, excessively trained, kisses and bites at the same time. Disillusionment arises when an echo was expected and applause arrives. In front of oneself, everyone simplifies themselves to wrest from others. Today, he who knows can feel like an earthly version of the divine. Requited love also disappoints when it reveals too much of the other. When everything seems to flow, a disturbing question arises: who wants to carry our destiny? The free spirit shows a greater demand toward the pious lie than toward the open lie. Music allows passions to enjoy themselves. Deciding implies closing one's ears, even to good arguments. Moral judgments appear as interpretations. The criminal usually falls below his own act. Changing one's opinion about someone carries a high cost. The list continues like a current. Pride, love, cruelty, truth, lie, compassion, power. Everything appears as direct observation, as if thought walked and pointed out what it finds without stopping too much. Laboratory without command. Specialists occupy the place of the creator. Speaking of hierarchies always leaves marks. Every time someone dares to do so, they expose something of their own, a wound, an accumulated experience. From there arises the need to intervene in a silent confusion that has been establishing itself between science and philosophy, presented as a gradual displacement, almost comfortable, accepted with a good conscience. From what has been lived, from what has cost, appears the right to take the word and to point out what is happening, to avoid speaking blindly or reacting from modesty, instinct, or discomfort. The man of science has been proclaiming his independence. First, he freed himself from theology, which he served for centuries, and that gesture was celebrated as a triumph. Then a more subtle movement appeared, emancipation from philosophy. That process fits into the modern democratic climate, where self-celebration flourishes and pride expands with ease. The slogan is repeated in a low voice and in a loud voice. Nobody commands. The result is a knowledge that begins to look at itself as supreme authority and prepares to occupy the place of the philosopher. The memory of one who has lived within science keeps innumerable comments loaded with arrogant naivety. Young researchers, veteran doctors, philologists, and pedagogues spoke of philosophy as if it were a useless remnant. Sometimes the specialist appears, alert to any attempt at synthesis. Other times the disciplined worker perceives in the philosopher an air of leisure and excess, something aristocratic that makes him uncomfortable. In certain cases, a utilitarian look arises that reduces philosophy to fallen systems and expenses without immediate benefit. There also looms the fear of a hidden mysticism or a displacement of the limits of knowledge. Frequently, the rejection of certain philosophies is transformed into a rejection of the entire philosophy. Behind that contempt, one usually discovers the persistent trace of a previous thinker. His influence remains active even without explicit adherence. Thus, a general disposition contrary to philosophy is formed. The figure of Schopenhauer left a deep mark in Germany. His fury against Hegel contributed to breaking the link with a cultural tradition rich in historical sensitivity, although he himself showed a notable poverty in that field. Overall, what most damaged respect for philosophy was the human mediocrity of many of its recent representatives. The lineage of the great solitaries of the spirit is missing, figures capable of sustaining a height of their own. Before certain philosophers inflated by fashion, it is understandable that an honest man of science feels of a better lineage, especially those who present themselves as philosophers of reality or positivists awaken distrust among ambitious young scholars. In them is perceived the specialist who aspired to a broader task without having assumed its weight, and who now expresses with words and gestures his distance regarding the sovereign function of philosophy. Meanwhile, science advances with a satisfied face, and philosophy is reduced little by little to a timid discipline, stopped at the threshold, deprived of the capacity to command. The development of the philosopher is surrounded today by dangers. The gigantic growth of the sciences raises a tower so vast that learning threatens to exhaust forces. The risk appears of being trapped in a specialty, of arriving late to the necessary height, or of reaching it with energy already spent. There also arises the fear of losing respect for oneself, of dissolving into a dispersed curiosity, of becoming a seducer rather than a guide. To this is added a greater demand, to pronounce a judgment on life and its value, a task that does not admit haste or comfort, and that puts to the test the integrity of the one who assumes it. For a long time the crowd had difficulties in recognizing the philosopher. He was confused with the scientific man, with the exalted devotee, or with the sage apart from the world. Saying that someone lives like a philosopher came to mean simply that he lives retired. The authentic philosopher, on the other hand, lives exposed, carrying temptations, testing himself again and again, playing risky games. Facing the creative genius, the average man of science resembles a respectable and sterile figure. He possesses virtues characteristic of a secondary species: industriousness, patience, regularity, moderation. He recognizes his equals and seeks the conditions that make his work possible. Moderate independence, recognition, visible utility. He also carries characteristic defects: petty envy, sharp gaze to detect the low in that which he does not reach, coldness toward those who advance like a powerful current. From the instinct of mediocrity arises his most dangerous gesture: to loosen what is tense and soften what is exceptional, always with a careful compassion that presents itself as virtue. The objective spirit occupies a valuable place. It functions as a precise instrument, as a fine mirror. It reflects, it records, it receives. It empties itself to let foreign forms pass. Its personal identity becomes light, almost accidental. It confuses itself with itself, neglects its own needs, and loses seriousness before its own suffering. It retains a strange joviality, born from a distance regarding pain. It loves and hates in a limited way. It shines when it reflects. Its function consists in serving as a medium. The confusion with the philosopher led to granting it excessive honors and to blurring its true task. When a philosopher hints that he moves beyond skepticism, he causes unease. Skepticism acts as a sedative in a tired Europe. It appears where traditions, values, and races mix. There the will becomes unstable and decision loses firmness. The era exhibits that fatigue under multiple disguises: objectivity, scientism, elegant neutrality. In some places the will resists with greater strength. In others, a latent tension accumulates. There exists a different form of skepticism, harder, linked to war and conquest, which appeared with force in the figure of Friedrich the Great. That skepticism grants the spirit a dangerous freedom and the heart a severe discipline. It nourished a critical and destructive tradition that deeply marked the German spirit and woke Europe from its slumber. Philologists and historians contributed to forging that bold gaze, capable of decomposing, exploring, and venturing into inhospitable territories of thought. The philosophers of the future may share traits of that temperament. They will be experimenters, critics, men of hard trials. They will sustain firm criteria, conscious method, and the capacity to be alone and answer for themselves. They will handle the cut with precision even when it hurts. They will seek a demanding relationship with the truth and will refuse to turn it into comfort. Their work will require discipline, rigor, and inner cleanliness. At the same time, they will resist being reduced to the role of critics, because in that they will recognize an affront to philosophy. It is convenient to stop confusing the workers of thought with the philosophers. The path toward philosophy may require passing through many levels: science, history, criticism, art, all that prepares, although it does not exhaust the task. The authentic task is not limited to knowing, but to assuming responsibility for meaning, ordering perspectives, and opening directions. Philosophers take the past as a tool and project their gesture toward the future. Their knowing intervenes, and their intervention leaves a trace. Throughout time, the philosopher lived in tension with his era. He functioned as an uncomfortable conscience of his present. By dissecting the dominant virtues, he revealed their wear and their hypocrisy. Facing a culture that locks everyone in their corner, greatness is measured by breadth, by the capacity to carry multiple responsibilities, and by the strength of a sustained will. In an era dominated by the herd, greatness includes solitude, difference, and the capacity to live on one's own account. What a philosopher is learned by living. It is also learned by accepting the limit of one's own knowledge. Speaking of it without experience leads to false opinions. Thinking in its highest form moves with lightness and necessity like a rigorous dance. There exists a hierarchy of states of the soul and of problems, and the highest ones require a long preparation, an inheritance cultivated for generations. To enter that world, it is required to have been formed for it, to carry great responsibilities, and to sustain a broad and slow gaze, capable of protecting even the misunderstood. Multicolored morality, habits without a sermon. When one speaks of personal virtues, an immediate doubt arises. They may exist, although they adopt a different form from those solid and visible virtues that sustained previous generations, those that serve to honor grandparents and at the same time keep them at a certain distance. Today's virtues belong to Europeans who are advancing toward another time, loaded with dangerous curiosity, inner complexity, and a skill for disguise. In them appears a softened cruelty, almost sugary, both in thought and in sensibility. The virtues of this landscape coexist with the most intimate impulses, with the most intense desires, and with the needs that burn inside. That is why the search occurs in internal hallways, in corridors where some things go astray and others disappear. Seeking virtues in that terrain implies trusting in their existence, and that trust evokes something ancient, a clear conscience that ancestors carried with them as a persistent mental ornament. The present is perceived as modern and not very respectable, and yet it retains that inherited remnant. Continuity acts in a silent way, while everything begins to transform. Modern life resembles a sky with more than one sun. Just as a planet rotates under multiple influences, current human beings act under diverse moralities. Decisions respond to different lights. They change tone, they are colored in varied ways, and they rarely appear simple. Many actions bring together several colors at the same time. That mixture defines the era. Certain behaviors that previously seemed extraordinary became habitual. Treatment toward the adversary was transformed in a silent manner. One learns to love while despising and to rise even in that gesture. Everything happens without solemn declarations or moral formulas, with a modesty that avoids naming virtue. When morality is exhibited, it awakens rejection, and that rejection marks an advance. Just as in another time faith was lost when the religious became a learned gesture, today something similar happens with moral discourses. The current conscience moves with another music, with an internal rhythm that shuns sermons and litanies. It is convenient to stay alert toward those who take pride in their moral sensitivity. Those who demand recognition for their tact tend to become implacable when someone fails before them. They accumulate memories, and that accumulation is transformed into silent hostility. Forgetful people, on the other hand, traverse even their own blunders without getting caught in them. In France, the taste for observing bourgeois mediocrity became a refined form of cruelty. Some writers made a constant practice of it. However, a more interesting field appears, the instinctive intelligence with which common spirits act toward those who surpass them. That cunning without conscience, almost religious, is finer than any reasoning. There, a constant struggle between the common and the exceptional unfolds, a spectacle worthy of being observed with a magnifying glass. Moral condemnation functions as a tool of compensation. Those who feel spiritually limited find in it a form of revenge and thus balance the terrain. Our morality acts as an equalizer. From that impulse arises the need to believe in a higher instance that erases differences, which explains certain resistances to atheism. An uncomfortable affirmation then appears. Spiritual height is measured by criteria other than moral respectability. That affirmation causes irritation and adopts disguises. It is presented as the result of a long moral discipline, of entire generations of exercise. Spirituality is shown as a refined form of justice applied to the order of things and the treatment between people. Enthusiasm for the disinterested enjoys great popularity. It is enough to observe closely to notice that what attracts demanding spirits is irrelevant to the majority. When someone dedicates themselves to that, they receive the name of disinterested. The amazement is born from not recognizing the interest that operates there. Even sacrifice pursues a gain, and he who sacrifices knows what he obtains. In this terrain, truth produces fatigue and moves with greater ease when it is not forced. Some moralities that proclaim themselves universal end up damaging those who possess singular capacities. Demanding the same measure for everyone impoverishes the rank. Laughing a little at those moralities is part of good taste. A pinch of mismatch sustains lightness. Where today compassion is preached, another tone appears. Under the noise, a contempt directed toward oneself is perceived. Modern man carries a deep dissatisfaction, and that burden manifests in the need to share suffering and extend it. The mixed European, heir to crosses and fragments, resorts to masks. He tests styles, adopts forms, and then discards them. Nothing quite fits him. That instability becomes an advantage. Never before has there been such a readiness for disguise. The era learns to study all masks and also to laugh at them. Perhaps therein lies a form of originality. Historical sense arises from that mixture. It allows for grasping hierarchies of past values and traversing overlapping cultures. The present becomes a crossroads. Inner chaos opens accesses that previously remained closed, and thus it becomes possible to enjoy ancient works with a new sensitivity. That openness brings with it a difficulty. The perfect and the closed generate distance. Moderation becomes strange, the impulse is oriented toward the unlimited, and risk gains attraction. Currents that measure life according to pleasure or pain are superficial to the one who creates. Compassion defended from that approach falls short. A broader gaze appears, capable of observing how the human being is reduced when suffering is eliminated. Pain, worked and sustained, has always been a source of elevation. Inside, unformed matter and creative force coexist and both need each other. Compassion that protects only the fragile part ends up weakening the whole. Those who live within a network of subtle duties recognize themselves as loaded with obligations. From the outside, they may be judged in another way, and yet they sustain strict demands. Sometimes they dance within them, other times they gnash their teeth. External misunderstanding persists. If honesty remains as a virtue, it is worked with hardness and with affection. Care is taken so that its shine does not derive into empty ornament. That virtue also knows exhaustion. Then it is convenient to sustain it with that which still causes discomfort, curiosity, risk, and the will to go further. That honesty can be interpreted as something dark and that loses importance. All virtues run the risk of becoming heavy, and life moves forward with greater lightness. For a long time, moral reflection produced boredom. That boredom functioned as anesthesia and fulfilled a function. As long as it retains that effect, morality remains harmless. When it acquires a seductive character, danger will appear. For now, repetition follows its course. Thus concludes this journey through virtues that are no longer exhibited, but continue operating, hidden, mobile and tense, in the interior of an era that advances without certainties. Commanding and submitting. Hierarchies that forge values. All elevation of the human type arose within a precise form of social organization, a form that lives with the conviction of hierarchy, perceives differences in value between people, and sustains that vision as necessary. In that environment, a constant distance appears between those who command and those who obey. That distance is exercised with the gaze, with the gesture, and with the daily habit of directing and submitting. From there, a deeper impulse is born, the desire to widen the distance within one's own spirit. From that exercise arise increasingly higher, rarer, and broader interior states. Thus, the elevation of the human being advances as a continuous self-surpassing that springs from a concrete social structure. The history of superior cultures exposes a harsh truth, resistant to sentimental ornaments. The beginnings of every elevated culture were marked by men of a direct nature, still close to the wild. Men of prey, loaded with intact will and appetite for dominance, who threw themselves upon weaker, more peaceful and more domesticated peoples. Sometimes they were communities dedicated to trade or herding, others exhausted civilizations that consumed their last remnants in fires of wit and decadence. From the beginning, the dominant caste was formed by these men. Their superiority resided in a more compact, inner energy, in a psychic force that made them more complete on all planes. Corruption adopts different forms according to the life that passes through it. When an aristocracy abandons its privileges moved by an exalted moral fervor, that gesture culminates a prolonged decomposition. For generations, that class gave up ground, lost prerogatives, and was transformed into an instrument of the central power. A vigorous aristocracy, on the other hand, perceives itself as the meaning and justification of the social whole. It accepts with serenity the sacrifice of many as a condition for the height of a few. It lives with the conviction that society functions as a base and scaffolding so that a select species may rise, in the same way that certain plants lean on a trunk to reach the light. Between similar individuals, a regulated coexistence is established based on the balance of forces. That agreement functions within a healthy body. When faced with other bodies, that same group deploys its vital impulse to grow, to extend, to draw toward itself, and to obtain predominance. That movement springs from life itself. Life acts as appropriation, as imposition of form, and as expansion. That dynamism expresses the will to power, a pulse that traverses all of history. For this reason, fantasies about future societies free from exploitation sound like promises of a life deprived of organic functions. Exploitation belongs to the structure of the living. In traversing the moralities that dominated the earth, traits appear that repeat until they reveal two fundamental styles. One is born among the rulers, the other arises among the submitted. In the first, values spring from high, proud and full interior states. The aristocratic man experiences himself as a creator of value. He honors in himself strength, hardness and the capacity for tension. He aids the weak from an excess of energy. He respects tradition and antiquity. He lives surrounded by rigor and discipline. In the other moral style, values are formed from pressure and fatigue. Qualities that relieve existence are highlighted: patience, kindness, and humility. Here, utility dominates. Power awakens suspicion, dangerousness is associated with evil, and the happiness of the strong is observed with suspicion. In that climate, the words that designate goodness approach those that designate simpleness. The yearning for freedom and the desire for relief mark this way of valuing. From there, it is understood why passionate love, as it developed in Europe, arose in aristocratic environments. Vanity is difficult to understand for the aristocratic soul. That search for external approval followed by submission to it seems strange to it. For centuries, the common man received his value from outside, and that habit left deep traces. Even today, many rejoice with any praise and suffer with any censure, moved by an old reflex of inner obedience. Vanity retains a residue of that past. Aristocratic communities function as mechanisms of selection. Hardness, uniformity, and simplicity of form allow a type to fix itself and endure. Virtues are formed from the experience of resisting under constant pressure. When the tension relaxes and abundance appears, discipline loses its vital function. Then variation arises. Singular individuals, deviations, and excesses appear. Together with exuberant growth, and accelerated decomposition unfolds. The old morality is exhausted, and the individual is forced to create their own rules and their own means of conservation and elevation. There is an instinct that perceives rank. It manifests in the tact of respect and in the silent reaction before what is valuable, even without protection. Some souls withdraw, keep silence, and immobilize their gesture. Others react with clumsiness. Thus, provenance is revealed. Sustained respect towards certain books and symbols functioned for centuries as an exercise of collective refinement. The traces of ancestors remain in the body and in the soul. Inherited inclinations persist even under the best education. In a popular era, educating is equivalent to learning to disguise provenance. Nature always returns. The aristocratic soul lives with a calm selfishness. It moves among equals with delicacy and respect. It gives and receives with security. It honors itself in others. It looks straight ahead or downward, conscious of its height. Late civilizations tend to reduce the heart. Vulgarity expands through repeated and easy-to-share experiences. The most similar prosper, the rarest remain isolated. Resisting that advance requires exceptional forces. He who descends into the depths of the human soul carries a particular weight. The psychologist of elevated natures contemplates closely the ruin of the exceptional. That vision impels him to seek relief among the ordinary. Success usually hides the truth of the one who creates. Many venerated figures were shot through with interior cracks. Deep suffering introduces an aristocratic distance. It forces the use of masks. Some adopt the form of joviality, others of intellectual rigor, others of insolence. Inner cleanliness becomes an instinct. Separating becomes necessary. The aristocratic is decided in a silent certainty that a soul has about itself. That certainty sustains self-respect. From there, thought advances, always surrounded by masks and pushed by a force oriented toward height.